Today, Michelle's at Ewing, and I'm Dawn Moore, the head at King Alfred School, and Michelle is a current parent at King Alfred. As we've been talking over the years, we realised that we were both in Berlin in the 1990s. I was in Berlin in 1990 itself, and Michelle has had experience of Berlin. So today we're going to tell you the story from two different perspectives of what it was like to be in Berlin at that time. We were very lucky, my partner and I, to be given the chance to actually go to Lübeck to stay in a house in Germany in the summer of 1990. And obviously we've been hearing stories of the wall coming down in 1989, and so we felt that we would do a complete trip and go to Berlin for the day. That's a story in itself. So obviously we got up very early, and we drove down through Germany to Berlin, and as we entered into what was obviously originally East Berlin, we were going down a single carriage road, and it was quite spectacular because we were sort of one of the only cars going in one direction towards East Berlin, and there was a complete stream of cars like ants in a chain going in the opposite direction, and obviously they were the Trabants leaving East Berlin to go to West Berlin, and we were told that they were going shopping. And there were hundreds and hundreds of mushroom sort of coloured Trabants in this queue, and we just remember thinking by the time they've got to West Berlin it's going to be time to come home again, because it was stationary in places and all the Trabants with their bonnets open and steam pouring out were actually quite memorable. So that was the beginning, and going into East Berlin that day. When we actually got into East Berlin, obviously we went on what is the equivalent of the underground in London. As we were going round, we could see sections of the wall in certain places, and with all the, like the barbed wire and everything on the top of it, sort of running between houses, almost as if it ran through a house at places. It didn't seem to sort of go round things, it just seemed to go straight. And so, there was quite a lot of graffiti on it, but it was still there in places. We obviously got off at some point, and we went to a section where there were still people actually physically with their hands and with sort of chisel pulling parts of the wall down. They were all tourists, it wasn't actually the East Germans or the West Germans themselves at that point. It was tourists, and they were basically all taking a piece of this wall home with them. We decided we'd have our photos taken, but we weren't actually going to, take a piece away. So certainly, that's one of the sort of big memories. And correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle, but my memory of East Berlin at that time was that the architecture and everything was really austere. There were a lot of statues of Lenin. I remember one in particular that was just amazing. It was absolutely huge statue of Lenin, which I think was actually taken away at one point.
Yes. It was taken away for
1982-ish or something. Anyway, but it was there, so no, it must have been later actually, 92.
Yeah.
Because it was still there in 90.
But it was everything was grey.
Yeah.
Everything was grey.
Yeah.
All the buildings
really,
were grey.
Yeah.
Very small windows.
Very grey, as you say. Very
Depressing.
austere, very stark, very angular.
And you were right about what you said about going almost through houses, because of course the big problem when the wall went up was that exactly was what happened, so that families were split between West and East, and this caused terrible problems when the wall came down again, because they couldn't reconcile themselves to their families anymore, had very rarely seen them if at all, and one had a very affluent lifestyle, and the other half of a family might have had this very different lifestyle, so it caused tremendous problems and riots and enormous family problems that are still going on really to this day, but certainly at that time were horrific, I think, for the East and West Berliners, I think. Well, now it's very different because it's very beautiful. They've made it a glass city. It's almost entirely glass. When we first went and Oscar was tiny, he said this will take a lot of window cleaners. And I mean, it is all glass, really. Very, very beautiful, nearly finished now. They've done a fantastic job, but it hides still an enormous amount of poverty and difficulty from people who lost all their savings, really lost their lives and never really recovered. Although they came to the West, they were never able to recoup what they'd lost. But certainly from a business point of view, East Berlin is a thriving community. People do still regard it as East and West, though, extraordinarily, even though there is no divide. And of course, Checkpoint Charlie is still there as a sort of memento of times gone by. My name is Michelle Zeget-Ewing, and I also have an experience of Berlin that goes back to when I was a child. My father was born in Berlin, and most of my relatives were born in Berlin. But in 1990 I was also in Berlin when the wall came down, as Dawn was, which had a very different feel for me because I'd been in Berlin on and off for all my life, and so it felt quite different. It felt very strange. When we'd been in West Berlin, there was always a wall. It felt like a very small town, and suddenly it felt like a very large town. But the biggest impact it had on my life was that my father was a very famous German theatre director and had been promised the Berliner Ensemble, which is the theatre in Berlin that was started by Brecht. And so when the wall came down, his life changed very much because he was asked to go and generate theatre in East Berlin for the East Berliners who didn't really want him there, with 2 other directors. And so we spent the following 2 or 3 years there with Brecht's daughter, who was by then running the theatre, in a very antagonistic state where every time we went to visit my father, people objected to him and his 2 colleagues being there in East Berlin because he was very much what they considered to be a symbol of the West. So my memories of the wall coming down, albeit the most fantastic thing in the long term, in the short term, were of a lot of anger and a lot of people who were very unhappy at the West infiltration, not just on a physical basis, but their culture and the whole feel they had for theatre particularly, which I've always been involved with.